Hello, I'm John Oyston, and this is going to be about a 1 hour slide presentation about the Caminos San Salvador and the Camino Primitivo. And it's based on a lecture that I gave to the Toronto Community Group in the fall of November 2025. So I'm going to talk about who I am and why I hike those Caminos, then the Camino San Salvador, then packs, apps, and maps. Then there was going to be a short break, and then we talk about the Camino Primitivo, and then some suggestions for what you might do after the Caminos. So I normally prefer to hike in remote and mountainous areas. This is my friend on the Alta Via in northern Italy. This is me crossing a river on the Lago Vega track in Iceland. And this is me hiking in the Polish Tatra Mountains. It had taken me about 5 hours to get to this location. It's going to take me another 2 hours to walk down to the lake where there was my accommodation for the night. So why should I or anybody else hike a Camino? Well, the things in favor are the satisfaction of arriving somewhere by your own effort and being able to see where you walked on a map, or even if you walked far enough on a globe. The Caminos are simple. You just get to a starting point and then you start walking and you go in the same direction every day. And they're great for solo travelers because you just meet new friends along the way. And the Camino is a unique and iconic experience. There really isn't anything quite like it. But what are the disadvantages of doing a Camino? Well, to my mind, it's generally fairly easy hiking and often on roads. Some people might consider that an advantage. I find that the scenery tends to be pretty rather than spectacular. There is too much contact with civilization, although again, some people think that being able to get a cafe con leche every 2 hours is an essential part of life. And in my opinion, there are sometimes too many pilgrims. So what did I decide to do? Well, I thought about it for 10 years, and eventually I decided I would choose the hardest and most obscure caminos in the most remote areas, and I'd walk in September, which is sort of the shoulder season. So my plan was to fly to Madrid, take a bus to Leon, and then walk the San Salvador north to Oviedo, where I'd pick up the Primitivo, and then walk to Lugo, and then on to Santiago. And if I had the time and the energy, I'd walk to the coast at Finisterre, then I'd take the train to Madrid and fly back home to Toronto. So I did the Camino San Salvador between the 10th and 16th of September 2024. There are very many Camino routes, and they go all the way across France and Spain and Portugal and into Italy and into other European countries. But the vast majority of them are heading to Santiago. But the Camino San Salvador is quite different. It starts in Leon and it goes north to Oviedo, completely ignoring Santiago de Compostela. It's a route of about 121 kilometers from Leon to Oviedo, and it's normally done in about 6 days. According to the Gronze Guide, this is a beautiful and physically demanding route that will satisfy those who enjoy silence and mountain scenery. So it sounded exactly what I was looking for. So I flew to Madrid and then got the bus from the airport up to Leon. I did notice that if I'd stayed on the bus for another half hour, it would have taken me all the way to Oviedo and saved me 6 days hiking, but that didn't really seem to be the point. So I arrived in Leon, which is a beautiful city with a fantastic cathedral. And I stayed in the Hostel Bayonne, which is my first experience of a Spanish one-star hotel, but actually it was really comfortable. The one-star rating basically means it has no facilities. You walk in off the street into a lobby area, you take an elevator or a staircase up a flight or two of stairs, and you get to some corridors with some rooms, but there's no bar, there's no restaurant, there's no coffee shop, there's no concierge, just basically a comfortable room and a place to sleep for the night. And it's perfectly okay. And this place is in a convenient location, and I recommend it. I went to the convent and picked up my credential for the hike. And also I saw one of my first of the iconic seashells that I used to mark the route. So I really liked Leon. It was a beautiful city, had a lot of culture, a lot of history, but also a lot of modern amenities. It's the sort of place you can imagine moving to and spending the rest of your life there quite comfortably. But as it turns out, I arrived there at 5:30 in the afternoon and I left at 8 o'clock the following morning. I had planned to spend a rest day in Leon, but if I did that, I would end up 2 days later in Polodura on the day of one of their festivals, the Feast of Saint Cyprian, when the hotel and the only restaurant in town would be closed. So I decided to head off straight away the next day. I was advised that one of the cures for jet lag is to hike 27 kilometers. And also, I was really keen to get going. So I started walking through the streets of the city and almost immediately got lost. So I did the only sensible thing for a pilgrim to do. I found a coffee shop and went in for a cafe con leche. And after that, and a little review of my maps, I found my way to this roundabout with the aeroplane in the middle. And I knew from my studying that this was the beginning of one of the trails. So there's two routes out of Leon, one of which goes through the park, which is the one I chose. It's a very pretty little route. It was a beautiful morning, and here is the very first of the yellow arrows, the Flechas Amarillo. This was just spray painted on a 4x4 in the park, but I was excited to see it. And I continued walking up through the park, heading north for an hour or so. But I knew on this route there was only two places to have coffee. And so after a little while, I switched paths and went along the road path and saw a more official looking sign that showed me I was going in the right direction. I stopped off in the Bar Central, just a little bit north of Leon, for my second breakfast, already ticking off one of my bucket list items for the Camino. I love the idea that when you get up in the morning, you just have a coffee and maybe a stale piece of bread or a croissant, and then after you've hiked for a couple of hours, you go into a coffee shop and you have a proper breakfast with some pastries and some cafe con leche. And also I got another stamp in my passport, so I was doing well. It was quite a long and quite pleasant walk, mostly on dirt roads with the views of the mountains in the distance. I actually met up with a couple of Canadian pilgrims, and we all ended up going to La Robla, which was a more attractive town than I anticipated, with some nice buildings, nice public square. The municipal albergue was a bit basic, but perfectly adequate. So this is my bunk bed in the bottom left-hand corner. You can see my backpack and my sleeping bag there. And this is the dining area, which is also fairly basic, but quite functional. And the two Canadian pilgrims that I'd met went to the supermarket and bought some trout and cooked us all dinner, which was a great start to my first night on the Camino. Next day I set off by myself and walked over this Roman bridge. And then further on, I walked over this more modern bridge and eventually got to the town called Buiza. You'll have to excuse my Spanish pronunciation, where there was the first hill that we had to climb. And it was fairly misty weather, not great views, but still it was quite a pleasant hike, quite a well-marked route. And you can see here the route going across the side of the mountain in the distance. There's very few other people around at this stage, and so it was very quiet, very peaceful. And eventually started walking down through some more agricultural land into the town of Polodura de la Tercia. The gentleman in front of me here is a Dutch undertaker that I talked to for a while. And I stayed that night at the hostel Rural Posada del Embrujo, which is like the witches' hostel, I think. And I strongly recommend this, particularly after the albergue. This looked like a total palace. Had a very nice bedroom, a very nice dinner. A rather more basic and simple breakfast was left out for us early in the morning. And we started heading off and going to a place called Llanos de Sumeron, which was 17 kilometers away. So this is the view of the mountains as we left town. And it was just a spectacular view, very bleak landscape, very hilly, very rocky. And at that stage, I was actually on the wrong path. These were two Americans that I'd had dinner with the last night, and they pointed out my incorrect route and corrected me because they'd seen a YouTube video and they knew about that issue. Eventually, this cross came in sight, walked all the way up to the cross and posed with it, and then kept on heading on the other side. The two Texans were hiking a little bit slower than me, so I left them at this stage. I ended up hiking by myself for about the next 6 hours. I headed down into this valley and eventually came to the road in 6:30. And at this stage, I was already nearer to Oviedo than to Leon. I actually lost the trail at the stage and spent a little while walking along the road until I found it again. I looked afterwards in the guidebook and it said, do not under any circumstances do this. This is a dangerous road and pilgrims have been killed on it. Anyway, I wasn't killed on it, and so I continued walking, giving this cow a bit of a safe distance. Walked down into another valley, and again, very spectacular, very remote scenery, and eventually came into the town of Llanos de Sumeron, which was like a medieval village. It was just amazingly old and it looked literally medieval. There were chickens in the middle of the street. And there's some nice views of the mountains in the distance. And there's an albergue. And so I stayed there. They were famous for their beans, which are homegrown. So I had a traditional stew of beans and sausage. The other pilgrims there were all Spanish speaking, and I really found out that having a 300-day streak on Duolingo did not really qualify you to be able to have even a polite dinner conversation with actual Spanish people. The next day was going to be a short day, only 13 kilometers, and there's a choice of two routes, one following the road and one which was marked as more difficult, going at that stage level across the mountain. And so I decided I had plenty of time. It was a beautiful day, and I went off by myself along the more difficult upper road. And for a while, it was absolutely spectacular. You can see this view down over the valley with the clouds and the mist. And in the middle of the picture at the bottom, you can actually see the road, which would have been the alternative route. So I was already way above the road. But it was a really nice path, a little bit overgrown in places, but very pretty. And I kept on going, and I kept on getting further and further away from the valley that I needed to be in. I needed to be all the way down in the bottom of that valley. And the maps that I had, both All Trails and Mappy.cz, didn't actually show the trail I was on, or indeed any trail on this particular mountain. So it was a bit disconcerting, but I had to believe that the Camino would provide and just follow the arrows and keep on going. I eventually came to a water fountain, which was nice, and filled up my water supplies, and then continued walking. And at this stage, I found a cart track that went down. You can see I'm a little bit closer to the road now. And it's very pretty. There was a waterfall. And there was a walk through the forest with all the ferns and the dappled sunlight. And eventually I came to a small village. And this is a place called Campo Manes. And it was here I had to decide whether I was going to turn off to the hostel at Ventuenos or not. I spent a while by this water trough trying to get in touch with the hospitalero because I didn't want to make a 2-kilometer detour if there wasn't room at the hostel. But she was having problems because her father was sick in hospital. But anyway, eventually everything turned out okay, and I went to Ventuenos. So this is the little village and the mountains surrounding it, very pastoral area. And so here we gathered. On the right, we have one of the Americans from Texas. In red, we have a guy from New York. And the other two people are a Spanish policeman and his son. And they had actually been there for the night before, and they climbed up to this hill in the background, which seems like a very worthwhile endeavor. I was also amused that in the fridge in the albergue, they had some soda that was called fresh gas, which I'm not sure what they quite meant by that. This is the inside, and I slept in the bed in the corner. It's quite a comfortable spot. This is the view from the kitchen, just looking out over towards the mountains. And then we were fortunate that they were able to open up the sanctuary for us, and we had a little private tour of the Sanctuary of the Virgin, which was a beautiful little church. And at the end, this is the collection box for donations. So this was one of the 3 donativos I stayed at. I was just so impressed by this system. You arrive, you don't check in, they just show you where the food is, show you where the bed is, and everything is provided for free. and there's an expectation at the end that you will leave a donation. But none of the three donativos I went into did they ever even discuss donations. It was just everything was free, you help yourself. And afterwards, the pilgrims would sort of look around and say, where do we leave our donation? And people would find the spot and leave some money. Next day, I headed to a place called El Rolu, which is north of Mieres. Mieres is the normal stopping point. This was a fairly typical garden shed in this area with the big stones in order to prevent mice coming into the grain storage. And this is the countryside. There's a little bit of road hiking at this section, but not very much. And then there's a pastoral section. And then there was a church that we visited. The guy from New York was a lapsed Catholic, and so he wanted to go and visit all the churches along the way, which was fine. And then there was a long walk along the road that you see here, which was fairly boring, but it was very easy, very fast, and there were a bunch of us hiking together and talking, and so we covered the miles fairly quickly. If you're going to go this route, I recommend detouring into the little town of Uho, which has a nice square with a kids' playground, church, and an excellent cafe. So we stopped there for a couple of pastries to refuel us for the rest of the route. And then eventually got into Mieres. This is a statue of someone pouring cider in the traditional way, where you hold the bottle above your head and you pour the cider down maybe 3 feet into a cup beneath you. And this is supposed to aerate the cider and make the flavor better. So I had a little snack here and then headed out of town to the little township or village of El Rolu, where I stayed at the hostel for pilgrims at Casa Alba, which I was expecting to be white, but in fact it's a yellow building up on the hillside. But I was welcomed there by a nice glass of red wine out on the porch. This was the place where the hospitalera did our paperwork and signed our, stamped our passports and gave us a glass of the local cider. And then in the morning, I got up early for the final day hiking to Oviedo, which is about 14 kilometers, and started seeing road signs and more built up areas, but also some more quiet areas and some more back roads, and a pretty section just going through a bit of forest. And eventually started going down, and there's some very prosperous looking farmhouses around this area. And so it's quite a pretty area to walk through, but a lot of road walking at this stage. And then the city of Oviedo came to sight in the distance. And here we have the city limits. And finally I made it. So this is the cathedral in Oviedo, and this is the certificate you get for hiking the San Salvador route. So I was pleased to get that. And then as a pilgrim, you actually get a free tour of the cathedral, which was well worth doing. I love the place. In particular, I'm a sucker for cloisters. It had some particularly nice cloisters. So then I stayed in this place, the Hotel Fidalgo. Again, it's a very basic hotel where you just go into the lobby, and I found it hard. Actually, I walked past this entrance 3 times before I realized this was the hotel entrance. And then you take the elevator up a couple of flights of stairs, and then there's a very comfortable room up there, and it was a very pleasant place to spend a couple of nights. And had a little mooch around Oviedo, which is a pretty city. This is the market hall, and treated myself to some of the local cider and a nice fresh salad. And so that was the end of the San Salvador portion of my hike. I just talked a little bit now about my packs, maps, and apps. So I am embarrassed by the size of the backpack that I took on this trip. It was a 50-liter Osprey backpack, which is way bigger than you really need. My excuse is that I did have a 32-liter Juta backpack that was originally going to take, but I felt that up in the mountains, I might need both a lightweight puffy jacket and a thin sleeping bag. So I couldn't get those and everything else I needed into my 32-liter bag. So I carried my 50-liter bag. This is a bag that is very comfortable. It's very well padded. It's very well constructed. I'm very comfortable using it. It weighed 25 pounds, which was a little heavy for a Camino, But earlier that year, I'd hiked for a week carrying all my own food, my tent and my cooking gear. And so I was used to carrying this pack with 45 pounds of weight in it. You'll also notice there's my shoes. People hike this route in all sorts of things, from traditional heavy above the ankle mountain boots to trail runners. So I compromise. These are a pair of Merrell walking shoes, so they have a good tread, but they're just below the ankle. And then I hiked with one hiking pole. That's just my thing. I like to hike with one pole and have one hand free. As far as maps and guides go, I use mostly the Gronze guide. It's a beautiful website. It's in Spanish, but Google Chrome will automatically translate it for you. Has a lot of details about every section of every Camino and all the places to stay. For maps, I used All Trails and Mappy.cz. Also, I use Google Maps for navigating in the towns, for finding hotels or cafes. All these maps you should download in advance, or at least somewhere where you have access to Wi-Fi, and then the GPS will work without needing any further data. I didn't notice anybody using a physical map at any stage on the trip. So this is Gronze, so there's an overview of the Camino Primitivo at the top. On the left, there's the route for one particular section, and then on the right, there is one of the albergues for that section. So an enormous amount of detail on that website. These are the various maps I used. All Trails is great if you're sticking to the approved trail, and it will help you follow that very nicely. If you're going off-piste and doing any variations from the trail, Mappy.cz gives more maps, more information about other trails, and is sometimes more helpful, and sometimes it's easier to use Mappy.cz to find out how far it is between two places. And then on the right, there's Google Maps. So if you have data, Google Maps will actually give you walking directions. And so this is how you would walk from the albergue in Grandas to the nearest bar, which is 7 minutes and mostly flat. If you don't have data, Google Maps will only give you the driving directions and not the walking directions. So for accommodation, I use booking.com. Many of the albergues are on booking.com, and a lot of the private hotels, the small hotels, will be on there too. For communication, I used WhatsApp. The groups of pilgrims I met were all communicating with WhatsApp, and many of the albergues will use WhatsApp, and you can make reservations using that system. For both those things, you're going to need data, and if you're not somewhere with Wi-Fi, a good option is to use an eSIM. An eSIM basically is a program on your phone that allows you to use a local data provider rather than using Bell or Telus or Rogers, and it's way much cheaper. So for example, Saley, which is a company I would currently recommend, will give you 10 gigabytes of data that will last 30 days for $16 US. And even 5 gigabytes of data is enough if you're just checking like menus in restaurants or walking directions or things like that. So in the live presentation, I would now take a short break, but seeing as this is online, we will keep on going. I'll now talk about the Camino Primitivo, which I did from September the 18th to October the 1st. So I hiked from Oviedo via Tineo and Fonsagrada. Fonsagrada, I wasn't feeling very well, so full disclosure, I took the bus from there to Lugo, and then I hiked from there the last 100 kilometers from Melide to Santiago. Melide is where the Camino Frances joins the Camino Primitivo. So this is the first documented pilgrimage. It was used by King Alfonso II of the Asturias in the 9th century. The current route is apparently very similar to the original route, and it's considered challenging. It's 309.5 kilometers long with 10,000 meters of elevation gain. This is equivalent to climbing the entire height of the CN Tower 18 times, and it's traditionally done in 13 stages. So here I am leaving Oviedo, heading to Grado, which was a 25-kilometer hike. As soon as I left the town borders, I was astounded to see a group of pilgrims in the wild. I'd never seen groups of pilgrims anywhere except in albergues on the San Salvador trek, so it was quite surprising to see half a dozen people looking at this map in the park. The lady on the left with the red shorts is a Dutch lady who was hiking as part of grieving the death of her husband, who died of a heart attack, which was very sad. So we looked at the map and we headed off, And it was immediately very pretty, walking through parkland and farmland with views of the valley and the mist. I quickly came to a small church where we stamped our passports, and I met Carol, who was a Dutch, sorry, who was an American anesthesiologist like myself, exactly the same age, also retired, but from Seattle. And so we continued walking, a pretty walk through some woods, nice views over farmland and valleys with some hills in the distance. And eventually we came into Grado, which is not a particularly impressive little town, but the albergue here was quite pleasant. And it had a huge backyard where people had set up tents, and there were geese. And on the right-hand side, there was a dormitory building, which is where I slept. And they had a nice dinner of an omelette and chips. So that was quite a pleasant place. And then continued the next day to Salas, which was a 23-kilometer hike. Every picture of the Caminos has to include a cute picture of an animal that you saw along the way. So here's a cute picture of a horse. This is climbing out of Salas. So along the way, we came to a place that had this notice: when life gives you pilgrims, make homemade lemonade. This section of the hike was somewhat marred by the presence of a motorway. We actually went underneath the motorway on several times. Also, you can see it was much more cloudy than we expected, and this was due to smoke from Portugal, from wildfires. Anyway, in general, it was quite pretty scenery. And shortly before Salas, I found this advertisement for an albergue, and it looked really nice. It was basically a farmhouse that had been converted into a country house hotel. And so I wandered in and checked it out, and they had a vacancy. So the public rooms were like this. They were just gorgeously beautiful. It was a sunny day. I got my laundry done and got some stuff put out to dry. This was one of the other public areas. Just a really nice place to hang out. And they had a restaurant there, which was fine. And I slept there in a dormitory. And the next morning I continued to Salas, and then on to Tineo, which was about 20 kilometers. So this is leaving Salas at dawn. And again, pretty scenery and nice views over to the hills in the distance with a bit of mist. Came across a church, and so we got our credentials stamped, and then had a little break and continued on our way. And there I am, just posing, basically. And we saw some contented cows in a field. It was all very pastoral, very pretty. And eventually we came to Tineo, which is a strange town. It's a moderately large town, and it's very sprawly, and the roads just go backwards and forwards along the hillside. So it looks almost like Switzerland or somewhere. This is Carol, the anesthesiologist from Seattle. And this is the place we stayed at, the Albergue Palacio de Muris. I didn't like it particularly. It was basically an upscale hotel. I think you can see there they have 4 stars. And they wanted a credit card, and basically they had a dormitory in the basement, which is all new and modern, but I didn't like it, just being picky. Anyway, next day we headed off. Then we had a nice dinner in their restaurant, so you can see it's quite a fancy spot. It's quite good food. And then the next day I had this beautiful view of Teneo as I left, heading to Boas. And again, I apologize for the Spanish pronunciation, but it was really cute just to see the town disappearing into the mist as we walked along this trail. And the weather continued like that, with mist and clouds over the hillside. And we started to ascend and got into a bit more wild and remote country, which I really liked. And eventually it started to rain, and this was annoying because the albergue didn't open till 3 o'clock. And we ended up having to hang out in the rain for a while for the 3 o'clock to come. Anyway, when we got there, it was well worth the wait. It's this farmhouse. So you go through these doors, and then on the other side, we were able to hang up all our gear, and just an amazing place to hang out for the day. And the sun came out, and they had cats to play with. And we had a nice communal dinner. The woman who runs it was Italian, so we had some nice pasta and some bruschetta. And this lady here is Victoria, and I'm actually hiking with her in Scotland in May. And this is the dormitory, which again is quite comfortable. That's my bed in the back there. And the neat thing about this place was that they put a laundry bin in the middle of the room and said, if you want to put your underwear and your t-shirts and stuff in the laundry basket, it'll be ready for you in the morning. So that was a really nice thing for them to add as an extra service. So another item on my Camino bucket list was to get up before dawn and start hiking by the light of my headlight. And I knew this was going to be a fairly big day going over the Hospitales route. So I did get up early, aiming, this is 7:30 because it's sunrise in Spain at this time of year. It's about 8 o'clock. And it was really nice just to go walking across a field, watch the sun slowly become brighter and the streetlights suddenly fade. And again, typical of the views, mist in the valley and hills in the distance. And I liked all the trees sort of shadowed against the clouds. And then I came to this, which I was really not expecting. This just a weird yogi bench with various strange writings on it. But anyway, this point marked the place where you had to choose between the high-level Hospitales route and the longer route to La Pola. And the weather was looking reasonable, and so most of us, I think, decided we would go the Hospitales route. So this takes you up onto some moorland where you hike for maybe 2 or 3 hours with no facilities at all. Unfortunately, the weather wasn't as good as it might have been, and the views weren't as great as I'd hoped. But this gives you some sort of idea of what it was like up there. And looking out across the valley and into the road in the distance. And eventually we started hiking down towards the road and towards Verducedo. And then as we descended, the weather became beautiful, and other pictures, people who hiked 2 hours after us, they got beautiful sunny weather for the whole Hospitales route. I was almost tempted to turn around and go back and do it again just to get some proper pictures. This was the albergue in Verduzco. There were several. This one was fine, except they didn't serve us any breakfast. So we left in the morning, and we knew we had a long day. And the first 4 cafes in town were all closed. And the 5th one, I was so pleased to see that it was open and doing good business. And so I had a nice breakfast there before I headed off to go to Grandes de Salime, which is 20 kilometers. This is hiking around the reservoir. So started heading up. The weather wasn't great, but it was okay. And then you get to this place where you suddenly walk over the edge here and you start getting a view of the reservoir. And so it was really quite spectacular. Would have liked a clearer day, but it wasn't too hot and it wasn't raining, so not too bad. And you start walking down towards the reservoir and eventually you cross the dam and then you go up on the other side. It's a very nice hotel restaurant just there. We stopped there and hung out for a while before we did the rest of the climb up into Grandes. And this is the route on the left that takes you up into Grandes. It's a fair bit of it is by the road, but then as you get nearer, there's a bit where you go through the forest. And it wasn't as hard or as difficult as I thought it might be. And then I stayed in the albergue Porto de Grandes. This is the downtown area. It's quite a pleasant small town with a couple of cafes and restaurants and a few shops. And obviously everyone hung out on the bar on the corner. And this is where I started realizing that everybody has the same story that they always tell to everybody they meet on the Camino, and everybody was giving potted biographies that I'd already heard in other places. So I wandered off by myself for a little while. Next day I was hiking to Fonsagrada, and so again I left early, and I was so chuffed to see that they'd actually got reflective street signs so that the route was marked and it was very easy to see by the light of my headlight. And typical, so many pictures I've taken, mist on the hillside, a few houses, a little bit of roads, and then getting up higher. By this stage it was raining quite heavily, and I stopped in this churchyard for a little bit of shelter and had my lunch. It was then a fairly long walk to Fonsagrada, but I met somebody who had been a student in Estonia at the time when the Russians were leaving. And we talked about that experience, which was fascinating. And so the journey to Fonsagrada passed fairly quickly. When I got into town, I really didn't like the place. It may be down on its heels, or it may be just that I arrived during siesta and almost all the coffee shops were shut. Eventually, I found a place to get a coffee and a piece of cake, and then I found out too late they didn't have any toilet paper in the washroom. So I continued on and trekked through some rain, through a bit of woodland, and eventually came to the Pension Complex Pineral, which was a weird place. It was partly a hotel, and so a lot of people were families there who had driven there, but they did also have dormitories, and I had a private room. Uh, but I wasn't feeling great. I got a bit of like low-grade flu, I think, and it was raining, and it was going to continue to rain for the next 2 days, which would be a 20-kilometer hike to Okadava and another 30 kilometers to Lugo. And at that stage, I reluctantly decided to take a bus and rest up in Lugo. I was always going to spend 1 day in Lugo. Now I'm going to spend 3 days there. I felt bad about that. When I got on the bus, he was the New York guy, and he was doing exactly the same thing. So I got to Lugo and had the long distance hike is called 0 days. It was a very pretty place. You can hike along the walls, which is what I'm doing here. There's a cathedral. There's some nice back streets, a historic spot. This is the cathedral, which is again a nice building. It had some nice cloisters. I always like cloisters. And this is the Roman wall, which is a very well preserved Roman wall, and you can take it and walk all the way around the city. I stayed at a place called the Hotel Brios, which is a small family-run hotel about 10 minutes outside the walls, which I recommend. It was a really friendly and cheerful place, and I liked it. They had a cafe and a restaurant there that I used a couple of times. It's a good place to hang out and rest up. Also, it was nice to get some non-Italian food for a change. There's not really much range of food available. It's like non-Spanish food. I found it in Spain, the food is a little bit the same everywhere you went, so it's good to go to an Indian restaurant. So after that, I was ready to go again. So my day 11 was at stage 10, going to Ponte Fiera. So I was up with the road sweepers, which was kind of cool just to watch them washing the street as I headed out of town. There's a Roman bridge that you go across that's guarded by a fake centurion and well marked with the Camino sign. This was kind of neat. It was raining, and some local farmer had the idea of just creating this little shelter out of his garage. And there was a slot machine that was dispensing candy and stuff. And there was actually a washroom in the back. Plus, there were some cats to play with. And so it was a welcome little respite from the rain, and maybe hopefully a little earner for the farmer. Then the sun came out, and so it was very pretty, just walking through some small roads and woodlands. Found a cafe to stop at, and it had an omelette sandwich, which was actually very good, and chatted to some other pilgrims for a while, and then continued walking. And at this stage, there was a whole pile of eucalyptus trees. This is like a eucalyptus area, and it's actually a tree that's introduced from Australia, and it grows very fast, but it may be invasive and might not be a good thing. Saw some cows in a field, and eventually ended up at the albergue at Ponte de Friera. And then next day was walking to Melide. But actually, I hiked another 5 kilometers beyond Melide to the German hostel in Borente. In this area now, we're into Galicia, and this is a traditional Galicia storage shed. And there's a church here, and around the walls of the church on the outside is places for, I guess, the bones or the remains of people who are buried there. Nice view of some farmland and a Camino sign. And then a walk through the woods with trees covered in moss. And then there was a long section on a sort of cart track with some distant views of the town of Melide, which is quite interesting, made a change. And also it was quite easy to cover the distance. The outskirts of Melilla didn't amount to much, but there was a central area with a square and a whole bunch of people enjoying themselves. Uh, but I continued on to the German hospital of Boente, which is 5 kilometers later on. That just divides the distances a little bit better for hiking. And this is a purpose-built hostel actually on the path and has a nice restaurant, and I would quite recommend it. So the next day to get to Opedruzo, and so this again is the New Yorker and his girlfriend. We stopped in this place for a coffee because it had been raining and we just needed to get warmed up a little bit. I got to Arzua, stopped for another coffee here, and then eventually came to Opedruzo, which was a strange place. So I stayed in this Peregrina Pension. So it was a building, and you went inside, and I had a bedroom in an apartment which was shared with a bunch of other people. So I had access to a kitchen, a laundry, and a big bathroom, which is kind of nice. The other people weren't around very much, so a couple of women there. So basically, for most of the time, I had the run of the place to myself. I'd actually brought some emergency packets of dehydrated food, and I carried them all this distance. So I ended up cooking those while doing my laundry. So it was a productive little resting day. And the next day was the day I was excited for. I was going to go to Santiago, and I was expecting that there would be a mass of pilgrims because all the different trails had joined by this stage, and it was going to be sunny, and everyone was going to be happy, and it was going to be a good end to the day. But it poured with rain. It rained fairly heavily the whole time, and most of the people that I'd known that I'd met on the Camino weren't there. And so it's not a particularly pleasant last day. You walk past the motorway, you walk past an airport, and these are the suburbs of Santiago, which are really not very impressive at all. Somebody had written some graffiti saying F the Camino, which was a nice welcome into town. For a different perspective on it, somebody's offering a discount on tattoos if you need something tattooed on you for a memory of the trip. But eventually we got into the old and historic part of Santiago, and you could see the cathedral in the distance. I stayed at the minor seminary, which is a little bit out of town, but I hadn't stayed in any particularly religious places anywhere else on the trip, so I wanted to do at least one religious stay. And this was my bedroom, which was, I thought, very suitably monastic. I was quite taken by that. It was also quite cheap. And so here I am, the obligatory selfie in front of the cathedral and also posing against the mile zero marker. Later that day, I lined up for an hour in the rain to attend the Pilgrim's Mass, and we did it, and the Buta Primero was not in use. But 2 or 3 days later, I realized that there was an evening pilgrim service, and that if I went there early enough, I would be able to so I was able to see the Buta Primero, the incense swinging, and so that was a great end to the Camino Primitivo. So after the Caminos, I decided to do a couple of things. One is I didn't really feel that I'd seen or understood enough of Spain or Galicia, and so I wanted to take a bus tour to see some other things. And I also wanted to go all the way to the end of the world at Finisterre. So I looked up on my websites and I found this excursion and a mussel boat tour. And so I took that. It was quite worthwhile. Went to a vineyard and got to sample some local wine and see how Albariño wine is grown. We went to a place called Isla de Toya, where there's a church where the outside is all made of shells. Should have been a nice place, except that it was raining. In fact, it rained pretty much the whole day. They took us out on a mussel wine boat tour, and literally it was all you could eat mussels and all you could drink wine. They just came by with bottles of wine and plates of mussels, and every time your plate was half empty, they would fill it up again. and really not a good thing to do halfway through a full-day bus tour. But nevertheless, that's what I did. And then they dropped us in town, and really the town, it was a weekend, so everything was shut except the seafood festival. And we'd already eaten way too much seafood already, and I really wasn't in the mood to eat any octopus. Um, and then they took us to a place called Compara, which is a very scenic town, a little bit overrun by tourists. And again, it was rainy, but it was very pretty. And we saw these Galician stone crosses. So at least I felt that I'd seen something a little bit more of northern Spain than just doing the Caminos. The other thing I wanted to do is to go to Finisterre. That's about a 5-day hike, but instead I decided to go down to the bus station early in the morning and catch a bus to a place called Cee, that's spelled Cee, and walk just the one last section. So that was a good thing. I would recommend doing that. So the coastal villages are very pretty, and then you get to walk inland for a while, and then you get to walk along some areas where you get some views of the ocean and some beaches. And then the final section going into Finisterre, you can walk along the beach, which is really nice, especially as the sunshine came out. Finisterre is a pretty little town. It has this beautiful harbour with all these fishing boats in it. It has a town square with a cafe, which I enjoyed and went to like 3 or 4 times. And great to see the local kids playing in the town square. Not hardly any traffic. I stayed here at the Hotel Vida, which was a pleasant modern hotel. And then the following morning, I did the compulsory trip to the lighthouse at Finisterre. The weather was not great. You can see how misty it is, but I did it anyway. And then I wanted to check out, there's a thing called the Lighthouse Route, which is something like a 5-day hike along the coast of death, the Costa del Muerte. But I found out it wasn't very well marked, and it was difficult to navigate, and the weather wasn't great. And so I did it for a couple of hours, and then I headed back inland and joined the normal Camino route between Finisterre and Murcia, and came back into Finisterre and joined the lineup of buses, so lineup of pilgrims waiting for the bus back to Santiago. So that's the end of my story. So if you want a different Camino experience, one which has fewer pilgrims, fewer bars and restaurants, but more peace, more hills and more natural beauty, I strongly recommend the San Salvador and the Primitivo Caminos. I have a blog. If you search for Oysten blog Spanish Caminos, you will find it, and there is more detail there and details of all the places I stopped at. Thank you very much for your attention.